Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the big data debate, the third debate of term. Tonight, as we sit in a world where there is a rapidly increasing use of the internet, both corporations and governments are now asking and using this enormous pool of data to their own advantage. And tonight, we ask, and ask all of you to ask, whether this is a sinister development or something instead to be welcomed. We have some fantastic speakers with us tonight, including one of Cambridge's top debaters. If you're joining us online, the hashtag tonight is #CUSBigData. Please do tweet us, please do get in touch online, so we have a record of everything that's said, as will Twitter, Google, Facebook, the NSA, MI5, everyone else who's watching. And if you're in the room, check the back of your order papers. There will be information on how to contribute. We welcome points of information, points from the floor at any point. But without further ado, I will hand over to our first proposition speaker, who is Dr. Jerry Fishenden. He's a trustee of Privacy International and the chair of the UK Government Privacy Consumer and Advisory Group. He was previously Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft UK. Dr. Fishenden, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to start off by talking about the proposition. This House fears the large-scale collection of personal data. I apologise in advance. I do have a bit of a cold, so I might croak from time to time. I come at this largely from a technology perspective, and I think this is an amazing time to be living in if you're a technologist. Almost every day we seem to see some new device or gadget or disruptive business model that comes out and transforms the way people can live their lives, whether that's Uber, power of Google, search, Amazon logistics, delivering things later the same day we order. So this is a fantastic time to be living in so many ways. And yet, on the other hand, every tap that we make on our keyboard, every time we touch our phone screens, every time we move around with a gadget in our pocket, data's being uploaded and sent somewhere, largely without our consent and often without our knowledge. So, with apologies to Charles Dickens, these may be the best of times in some ways, but I think they're also the worst of times. And I think it's a very disappointing business model that we're seeing around technology at the moment. There is so much potential upside here, and yet we do have this pervasive business model that relies on taking and commercializing our data. I mean, of course, some of it we do share voluntarily for good reason, often as a trade-off because we think there's a benefit to us of doing so, and store loyalty cards and things are a fairly obvious example of that. But it is somehow ironic that it was only a short time ago that we used to point at totalitarian states who spent all of their time monitoring the lives of their citizens, and we used to point righteous wagging fingers at them and tick them off for that behavior. And now that seems to be almost the business model of so many modern corporations and the way they behave towards us in our daily lives, sort of asset stripping and fracking our data for their own ends without much regard to us and the part we should be playing in this ecosystem. I mean, if you think about it another way, wouldn't we find it very odd if every morning we came down and found people rummaging through our dustbin, sort of looking through things we've bought, letters we've discarded, bills and things. And then perhaps a person follows us around all day, observing where we go. They sit close enough to eavesdrop on our conversations. Maybe even more bizarre, perhaps they'd run up to us from time to time and go, "I think you want to buy this car." Or, "That house over there might suit you, don't you think?" I mean, we'd think somebody like that was very bizarre, and yet actually that's what technology is enabling so many companies and other organizations to do in the way we live our lives. And yet, why should that be? Why do we take this for granted? I mean, how many people even understand the full extent of the data that they leak and bleed everywhere they go? Often because the technology itself hasn't been well designed and doesn't enable us to have the control. Instead of using new technology to partner with us, things are being done to us, and we're meant to assume that the benefits we get override the downside of the way our personal data may be acquired and used by parties unknown. And I'm sure my critics will go, "Oh, nothing to worry about. The benefits, the upside of this are so great that we shouldn't need to worry about that. You know, what does it really matter if people know where we live and what we're buying, who we're seeing, how we're voting, all that type of thing? It doesn't really matter. Isn't it nice that you can look at a map online or order an Uber vehicle and they know where to find you? Isn't the upside better, and wouldn't we lose that if we didn't provide our personal data? And I'd say, well, actually, if you look at the advice given by those who protect our national security, their advice is very clear. Aggregating bulk personal data is a huge risk. They advise governments against it. They advise people against doing that because collecting and aggregating bulk personal data is an incredibly attractive and potentially volatile asset for foreign hostile powers and hackers and anyone else that might be interested in getting hold of that data. And I think we should heed those warnings. These are people that know what they're talking about and they know the risks. If our bulk data is collected, sooner or later, it will find its way to whoever wants it, whether that's by accident or design. So what? Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Isn't that the phrase we keep hearing trotted out rather banally from time to time? The very same phrase that those totalitarian regimes also used to use as part of their sort of dehumanizing and taking away of control from their citizens. And I think, well, some of the people I work with in the work I do, that's quite a harsh phrase. I mean, when you consider undercover law enforcement officials, witness protection program, people abused spouses, children at risk, saying to them nothing to hide, nothing to fear because their personal data may be used, I think is quite an insulting thing to say. They do have something to fear, and for very good reason. And so should we. We may not be in quite the same vulnerable situation those people are today, but we could be tomorrow. And there's no going back. Once our data is taken, we can't take it back. And this is only going to get worse with the Internet of Things. Today, it's our sort of fitness bands and smartphones in our pockets that bleed our data everywhere. Tomorrow, it'll be our fridges and dishwashers, our smart meters. Everything will be relaying information to us, our cars. So the situations only get worse, and none of these devices have been engineered with security in mind, and certainly not with our privacy and control in mind. And the irony of all of this is I don't think it's even necessary. There are better business models out there, and there have been for over a decade. Ones that would enable us to take control of our personal data and decide who and where and when we want to choose it. So we could still get the upside if we choose to take that, but we would retain control over our personal data. I mean, that seems to me a truly radical idea, enabling us as either consumers or citizens to be placed in that center, if you like, and having that level of control, which is a very dangerous idea, which is why it's not yet taken off, because it threatens so many existing business and government interests, rather like democracy itself, perhaps. But I think we need to urgently take that type of model and look at it and go, how could we move to a world where we have control over our personal data and choose who and where we might share that? I think until that happens, what do we do? That sounds very esoteric. Well, I think in the meantime, there are tools. They're not as easy as they should be to use, and I think the technology industry could help here in making it much easier to use end-to-end encryption to protect our data, to use ad blockers, to make it much harder for our personal data to be taken without our consent, and certainly should never be taken without our knowledge. And I don't think either that we should see this large-scale collection of our personal data as some sort of price we have to pay for entry to our digital age, as if it's some sort of ransom or blackmail that we have to hand over before we can use a gadget. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think we should fear the current abuse of our personal data because it's actually become the biggest risk to this amazing digital age that we're only beginning to understand. And I think if we don't get that control in place soon, the whole digital age will begin to founder because it's undermined by the extent to which our personal data has been taken and abused and control has been lost. So I think I finished by saying I think it's time for us to take control. I think we can have the upside of the digital age without the downside of the fear of this risk of taking our personal data and aggregating it and using it in ways we don't want. And that's a very real fear. I think it's time we kept our personal data secure and under our own control. And ultimately, it is our personal data. The clue's in the word. It should be up to us how we manage and control that data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fishenden. I'll now hand over to our first opposition speaker of the night, who is Professor Christopher Millard. He's Professor of Privacy and Information Law at Queen Mary, University of London, and has had over 30 years of experience in technology law. Professor Millard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Mr. President, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour and privilege to be here. I wanted to start by wishing you all a very happy Data Protection Day 2016. Now, you may not have known it, but this day, every year for the past 10 years, has been Data Protection in Europe, Data Privacy Day in the US. So this debate is extremely timely. And I don't want to miss the opportunity, being in one of the world's most ancient, most distinguished research institutions. I want to do a bit of research right here, right now, and I'd ask you to help me with this. Don't bother we'll talk about the Research Ethics Committee in the bar later, but let's just do it, okay? Let's just do it. So I would ask you to help me, please, by raising your hands if in the past 48 hours you have used any of the following. Facebook. That's actually, keep your hands up, please. That's more than I expected. I thought Facebook was for old people, he said. Okay, Facebook. Okay, what else have we got? Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp. Well, keep your hands up, sorry, if you've done any of these. What you probably didn't realize, they're all Facebook as well, but never mind. So you're not as young as you thought. Okay, what about Twitter? Is anybody left? Yes, somebody there. Email? I think I've got everybody. Mr. President, I think the case, thank you, hands down. The case is kind of proven on an empirical basis. You know, if n equals the occupants of this house, it looks like about 100% do not in fact fear the large-scale collection of personal data. And I won't insult your intelligence by asking if it ever occurred to you that those activities you've just said you do, and you don't seem to regret, involve the collection of a large amount of personal data. Happy to take a point of information. Yes, sir.
Can you say your name and college for the record so we can get your personal data?
Good job.
Or just shout.
Sorry, yeah, on that note, my name's Ashton College.
Noted.
I think you're making a false, you're drawing a false case. Just because we use these things, it doesn't mean that we want to and that we accept everything that comes with them simply because large corporations control them.
Thank you. I take your point. It's a very good point. I will answer it. Because you've made one of the classic arguments, which is that we are completely passive, helpless individuals. We have no idea what's going on. I want to address that because I don't actually believe that. But before that, I want to just talk a little bit about what's actually in the motion tonight. I'm afraid, fear not, I should say, not I'm afraid, fear not, you're not about to get a law lecture, but we do need to define our terms. This is about personal data, which is a defined term in law. So in the EU Data Protection Directive and all the laws in the EU and indeed in many countries around the world, personal data means information about an identified or identifiable living individual. That makes it very broad. So identified is obvious things like your name. Identifiable may be an indirect connection, such as the fact that you might be associated with a particular IP or Internet Protocol address, maybe some genetic data about somebody else that could be linked back to you. So I fully accept personal data is an extremely broad concept, and there's a huge amount of it out there. But please bear in mind that at the heart of this motion is the concept of collection of personal data. Now, collection is also a legal concept that's long established. It's the first part of a much longer information life cycle we call processing of personal data. So collection is the first stage, really, where you gather the information. Stuff that happens later, such as analysis and reuse and disclosure to other people, and transfer of data across borders, all of these things you may hear about later tonight, they are not collection. So I would say, on a strict reading of the motion, things like surveillance are completely out of scope, because they are not about the initial collection. But let's just allow the fact. Yes? You can give a false name, by the way.
I'll just fail to give a name entirely. I'll go by some anonymous guy sat in the front row in black tie. But surely, given the user has got most control over collection rather than processing, surely that's the step we want. If we're concerned about the processing afterwards, we should be concerned about the collection if it's not collection per se.
Yes, okay, thank you. I will take that point immediately then. So I accept that we can talk about collection in a broader sense if you want. But I want to talk about how we actually do this collection, and you've really helped me there because you've pointed out that we as users have the most control at the point of collection. So sometimes in these debates you get this Orwellian dystopian picture that Big Brother is out there spying on you and watching your every move. That is not how large-scale collection of personal data actually happens in the real world. I became what was then called a computer lawyer back in 1982, and the following year, Sting and the Police had a great hit with a song, Every Step You Take, I'll Be Watching You. Anybody else old enough to remember that? Great. I'm glad I'm not alone. Now, that was great at the time, but it's actually rather passé now, because that isn't actually how it works. It should update it for 2016. It'd be something like, every step you take, you'll be telling me all about it and broadcasting it to the world. It's really flipped on its head. It's completely the opposite model for surveillance, if you want to talk about surveillance. Indeed, isn't the hope of being watched the main reason why people use what the sociologists among you, if there are any, would call performance activities? So don't you actually want people to like your Facebook and Instagram posts? Don't you want them to retweet your tweets so that people can benefit from your acerbic wit and extraordinary wisdom on all matters instantaneously? Indeed, I had a look in preparing for tonight at the Cambridge tab, which I have to confess I had never looked at before and will probably never look at again. And I was interested to see that some distinguished members of your executive committee of this House have taken the whole idea of performance to another level. Indeed, I would say perhaps performance is the wrong term. I mean, exhibitionism springs to mind as maybe more appropriate, but we better move on from there because, who knows the age of the people who might watch the video stream later. Okay, fortunately, we don't have any graphic evidence to show you right now. Now, does this mean that we shouldn't care at all about what happens to our personal data, what's collected, and so on? On the contrary, I believe very strongly that we should be informed, we should be mindful, we should be intentional about how we collect and share personal information about ourselves and also about other people, because we do a lot of this about other people too. We should not be naive. I fully accept the argument made earlier. We should not be naive about the activities of governments, of corporations, of anybody else who is collecting personal data, and this idea that you can now get in the internet economy so many things free, effectively. Your free app, as the old adage says, if you're not paying cash for a product, then there's a good chance that you are the product. Fully understand that, but that's, and again, another example of how we are in direct control. We should hold to account public officials who do things with our personal data. Indeed, I'd particularly like to acknowledge the huge contribution made by one of the speakers on the other side, who you'll be hearing from next, who has done a great job in putting into the public domain large amounts of personal data, including sensitive personal data, about politicians in this country, in the expenses scandal. So I would say, we should hold these people to account. And in terms of the earlier points made about what we can do to protect ourselves, as I said, I do not accept that we are just completely helpless and tossed about in the sea in this whole debate about personal data. There are things we can do. We can choose how much to share and how to share it. You can think before you tweet. You can take technical measures to protect yourself. Some of you probably do this already. If you want to do some private surfing on the web, just use a VPN. Start using passwords, vaguely, sensibly. Most people don't, so the bar is set very low at the moment. Consider using a password manager. Consider using encryption if you really care about confidentiality. There's a lot you can do. Some of it sounds obscure and techy. Actually, it's very cheap and easy if you can be bothered to look at it. And indeed, if you want to be really radical, you could do something that hasn't been seen for quite a while and put your phone off and actually engage in F2F communication. Now that's a code, and again, checking for tonight, because I realize these TLAs, these three-letter acronyms, do evolve in time, and that has some quite racy connotations, perhaps appropriate for the executive of this house, actually. But F2F, in the old sense that I'm familiar with it, is face-to-face, live communication between wetware, you know, human beings talking to each other. That is still possible. You're not completely at a loss here in terms of control. But apart from self-help, do we have any other protection? Does the state, contrary to being invasive, actually do anything to help us? Yes, I'll take your point. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all fine and good, but, I'm sorry, Charlotte Northrup, St. Catherine's College. That's all fine and good, but shouldn't the onus be on other people not to spy on us rather than to just on us to make sure we're not being spied on? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point that will be debated further, but my key point here is that at the starting point, as this gentleman pointed out earlier, we have a lot more control than is generally acknowledged in this debate about surveillance. What other people do later is another matter. Sorry, I can't take another point for you right now because I want to just get through my other main points. So is there any other kind of protection? Well, in fact, over 100 countries around the world now have data protection laws, and you may say, yeah, but are they enforced? Do they have any teeth? Well, I would accept that in the past they have not been particularly effective. However, that is changing, and we are starting to see some quite significant interventions and powerful new laws. For example, just last month, on the 15th of December, political agreement was reached in the European Union for a new general data protection regulation, which will make it mandatory to do various activities such as privacy by design, privacy by default. So various privacy-enhancing technologies will be required by law for new products and existing products and services. I will skip over what the European Court of Justice has done lately, because I'm told I haven't got much time left. But I want to go even further away from fear, because as the writer on security matters, Bruce Schneier, aptly put it in his book entitled Beyond Fear, it is time to start having a sensible discussion about security. And it may be that if we can just get our heads around taking responsibility for our own data and other people's data at the point of collection, we can do a lot. And it might even be that there's a case for going beyond fear to the point of actually welcoming, embracing large-scale collection of data. Why would I say that? Here's just one area in the time available to mention. Using big data analytics, epidemiological research is now being undertaken to identify specific causes of many diseases, including genetic factors, and more personalized solutions are being developed for specific medical conditions. And indeed, this great research university, the University of Cambridge, is playing a leading role in this kind of big data analytics research for medicine, a role that it could not play without the large-scale collection of personal data. So, in conclusion, just 3 points. First of all, we are not passive, helpless observers. We are empowered actors, and if we make any effort at all, we can find out what's going on, and we can do a lot about it. Secondly, don't underestimate the impact of data protection law as a mechanism for protection. This new regulation I mentioned will increase the maximum fines for breaches of your data protection rights to 20 million euros, or 4% of global turnover. Now, some of you probably think 20 million euros is quite a lot of money. Actually, it isn't necessarily in this debate a lot of money. Let's take a company you've probably heard of, Apple Corporation. 4% of global turnover for them last year. That's more than $10 billion fine, one fine. So there are real teeth in terms of data protection law. And finally, the speaker opposite in his introduction talked about the Internet of Things and how this was a scary and terrible thing again. Actually, I personally think that the opportunities and the public benefit and the individual benefits that can flow from connected and smart healthcare, transportation, education, many other applications of the Internet of Things and clouds of things are a potentially enormous benefit to all of us. None of them, many of them at least, are not possible without large-scale collection of personal data. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I demonstrated, I hope, at the beginning that this House does not in fact fear the large-scale collection of personal data, nor should it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Millard. Sorry. Now's your opportunity to have your say, to get involved in the debate. Does anyone have any points that they would like to make in proposition of the motion? Does anyone here fear personal data? Yeah, just down here.
I'd just like to make the point that we have no control whatever in relation to data, that we don't even know it's there, because we can't then challenge it. We have no power in relation to data of the existence of which we are ignorant.
Do we have any points in opposition of the motion? Yeah, in the middle here.
Hi, Patrick Flynn Katz. I think it's really important to remember what the actual consequences are in our lives. We get targeted ads that we can easily shove to one side. And in the very, very worst case scenario, as happens every now and again, but the probability is incredibly small, something gets leaked and you get asked to change your password, you do it, and then the problem is kind of solved because they don't really have access to you anymore. So are these even worst case scenarios really anything to fear? In order to fear it, it must be really, really bad. And I think even if you accept that it is bad, I think to fear it is a bit extreme.
Does anyone on the proposition want to respond to that? No, we'll have a point in abstention then. We'll go at the back over there, because you offered one in opposition, so you need to make your mind up.
I don't think we've heard really enough from either of the first two speakers about the notion of consent and how quickly we're giving this away, or how it is considered to be given. In particular, having a big form saying you're giving all this away in return for this, which none of us really read, I'd like to hear from all speakers whether they think that's enough, or whether, even if we decide that we are going to give away personal data, whether we ought to know more, or whether we should be informed more about what we're doing. Thank you.
Okay, we'll head back to the main debate now, but I will take some more floor points after our next couple of speakers. I'd like to move on to Professor Heather Brooke. She's a journalist and FOI campaigner and the author of The Revolution Will Be Digitized. However, she's perhaps best known for helping The Guardian edit and publish the WikiLeaks US diplomatic cables and the MP's expenses scandal. Professor Brooke, thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm sort of bound to this thing with my microphone, so I won't be striding about. Those 2 points were a very good introduction for what I want to talk about. The second book I wrote was called The Silent State, and it really illuminates what the issue that we're talking about. And I think, which hasn't been spoken of already, I'm kind of I'm in an odd position because I'm a transparency campaigner, and I did expose the MP's expenses scandal, but also I'm a trustee on Privacy International, and I'm very much an advocate for personal privacy. And you'll think, well, isn't that sort of like cognitively discordant? How can she hold those two things together? And it's actually very easy. I believe in privacy for the private citizen going about their private business, and transparency for the public official or the powerful person who is influencing or making public policy or doing public work, making public decisions that affect us all. So there really shouldn't be any conflict between those two. And yet I find that we live in this topsy-turvy world where increasingly the private citizen going about their private business is transparent to a state, to powerful corporations who actually want their own privacy and make a lot of effort to create laws and to stop us knowing what they're doing in our name and often with our money, e.g. MPs. So for me, it really boils down to power. And one of the points that the speaker one of the audience members talked about, consent. Because in a democracy, the whole point of a democracy is that we are informed citizens. And again, the clue's in the name. How can you be an informed citizen without information? We need information about corporations and about our government. It also means that we have a level of autonomy, that we believe that we as citizens know best what's best for us. We don't have some paternalistic government that thinks it knows best what is best for us. We get to make our own decisions based on information that we find out. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. So the consent for it to be meaningful and for it to be informed, we need information We need to come to those decisions freely. We can't be coerced. And it can't really be a Hobson's choice. And this is one of the issues that was addressed earlier, is that, you know, there's been studies about when people have those, when you sign those terms of conditions that really annoyingly keep popping up on my iPhone all the time. Like every week I've had one, where I have to sign this giant new terms of conditions. And I sign it because if I don't sign it, I can't carry on using my phone. It's just gone. And so for me, that isn't actually meaningful informed consent. I don't actually have a choice. I have a Hobson's choice, which is I can no longer use a product I've paid for, or I sign up for all their terms and conditions. So that is not really a meaningful choice. And I wouldn't say that we've given consent just because we've had to sign these things. The big point as well is about being informed, and I feel this is where the real absence is that we just don't know. We don't know what information is collected, we don't know how it's used, and we don't know who it's shared with, both in corporate data collection and in government data collection. So I just had a chat with somebody this morning, just randomly ran into him, and he works here in Cambridge, and he's come along in the audience, and he was telling me about the latest in personal data collection. And I like to think I'm pretty on top of this stuff, but he was telling me that the latest now is about emotional analytics, where companies have started to study facial movements in very minuscule degrees to find out how we emotionally respond to ads that we might see. And they create profiles based on having these masses of data points that they then generate. And they can use that to kind of predict our personality. They can look at our personality, can start to make decisions, they can start to make predictions about how we're going to react to certain things. And that just sort of, you know, blew my mind a bit, because we're going from you know, just taking historical data and maybe being able to predict about how people might interpret what you say to them, or how they might interpret something, to actually manipulating them right in the way they think, cognitive manipulation, which I find really interesting and quite frightening. And the whole idea of social psychology being used more and neuroscience being used more to try and predict how people are behaving and how they respond to information that's given to them. So that's happening in the commercial world with almost none of our knowledge. I mean, this was the first I've heard about it, and I feel like as an investigative reporter who's written a book about the digital world, and particularly about data dealing, the trade in data, personal data, that I would know about this. But there's all this new stuff being done without our awareness. Then you have the state, and I'm going to start with sort of, we're not just talking about GCHQ and you know, MI6 and the NSA. Even in Britain, when I was researching my last book, The Silent State, I tried to just create a organogram of all the databases that the state has of personal information. It was actually really difficult because there are no press releases going out from the Home Office or from the local council telling you about all the data sets they have that contain personal information about you. They're not releasing that. And so I had to do a lot of research to really try and document out what all these databases were that existed. And one of the ones I found most scary was collected by Slough Council, and it's replicated in lots of councils around Britain, and it's a violent offenders and potential violent offenders register. And this is where somebody in the council decides that a person they've encountered is violent. And they make a subjective decision, and they put that person on the list, and it means that you've been marked, and whenever you come into contact with any council employee or any other, there's a whole variety of public officials that will be notified that you're on this list, and they always have to meet you in the company of somebody else. So the reason I found out about this is a woman who had been trying to be a foster parent was rejected from being a foster parent because she found out that she'd been marked on one of these potential violent offenders registers. And the reason she was on it is not because she did anything violent There was no physical violent act that she did. What she did is that she had witnessed a kid in a local park pulling up all these flowers. She'd complained to the kid's parents. They got really arsy with her. She called the police. The police came 45 minutes later and did nothing. She was really angry about it. They said, we can't do anything about it. It's a council problem. You've got to deal with the council, antisocial behavior unit. So she phoned up the antisocial behavior unit. They couldn't care less. She got really angry and said, why are we paying you? You've told us to report these things, and now you're doing nothing. You're totally useless. You should drop dead. So you might say, oh, she made a threat. The woman who received that didn't think anything about it. She didn't care. Nobody in the council cared. Nobody thought she was violent. They just thought she's really angry. Until, I think it was about a month and a half later, she wrote a letter to the newspaper, the local newspaper, and they published it, and she got a lot of support. And that is when her name went on the register. So they used it as a way to intimidate her and to basically get her to stop publicizing her experience because the council was getting bad PR. That was a bit of a digression I went on there, but the point I want to make with that is that these data sets can be collected. It would be one thing if we all agreed that that was something that for our public safety we needed to have, and we agreed, we had a discussion about it, we consented that we need to have these data sets of personal information. I was on this independent surveillance review panel last year, and it's one of the committees that was in charge of having a look at the way the intelligence agencies were accountable or not. And one of the things that really was disturbing to me was the fact that so many of the big, what I would consider mass surveillance, but they don't like the word mass, so they call them bulk surveillance, were done without any consent of the population of Britain. They actually weren't. A lot of the programs that were rolled out that my colleague over there, the first speaker, thinks are not, that don't contain personal information, which is basically they tap an undersea cable and they hoover up all of the internet traffic. They hoover up all communications traffic, all telecommunications traffic. And this is not considered mass surveillance because they're not actually listening to it all. They only think that the analysis of the information is surveillance. Well, as a journalist, I can tell you that actually just the fact that that is all collected, and at any time they decide that you're a person of interest, or you're just a bit of a pain in the ass, or subversive in any way, not that you're a terrorist, but you're subversive in the way that you're challenging their authority, or you're challenging the system, or you're asking awkward questions, it means that already there is a giant repository there of all of your personal information. And that is incredibly dangerous. And we should be incredibly fearful of giving that power to the state. Because as a journalist, as an activist, even as a citizen, we really need to worry about the fact that all of our personal information could be collected by the state. Companies as well are becoming de facto intelligence gatherers for the state. And imagine if suddenly, maybe it's not you, maybe it's a friend of yours, a relative, whoever, they start to ask too many awkward questions. Then it's only a matter of tapping into these databases, and you will find that you are intimidated, pressured, silenced. And if we want to be a democracy, then we really must fear the mass collection of personal data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brooke. Our second speaker on the opposition tonight is an economics and politics student at Durham, where she was president of the Durham Union. She's a competitive debater who got through to the octafinals at this year's World University Debating Championships. Katie, sorry, her name's Katie Hurd. Didn't say that at the beginning. Katie, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Look, we'll admit on our side of the house that we don't just have issues with presumably how we collect data. This is also a debate, presumably, where we talk about what that data will then be used for. How is that going to be interpreted? How is that going to affect our lives? Because, to be honest, no one cares if I have something on you. It's until you use that in a way that might harm you, and that's when we care about it. Look, we'll even take the highest side of this debate, which is when the government takes it without your consent, and why that's potentially a better thing than the outcomes and ways that they could collect information in other ways. Because bear in mind, we live in a world where we're constantly fearful for our lives. We're constantly in fear of outcomes that could happen in the future that are beyond our control. And we put our trust in the state to protect us in ways in which will benefit us and make sure we can continue to live happy lives. We will say on our side of the house that perhaps this is better done with mass surveillance and the ability to collect this data on a large scale, even if it isn't without your consent. I'll get onto that in a second. But first of all, just a few responses to what Op said, to Prop. So, they point out the fact that it's slightly weird that logistically now data's targeted. It's a bit creepy. Look, I'm just happy I no longer receive spam emails asking me about penis enlargement, right? I would much rather receive the targeted advertising that is meant for me, right? Because that improves my life in a quantifiable way. Even if that's a small benefit, that is still more of a benefit than used to be. But this idea that hackers exist and we should have more consent, we agree, right? We don't have to stand for the system as it currently exists. We can say things like, you should have more education in schools as to what data should go on the internet and the kind of things. It's stuff that's being developed in things like IT lessons currently, and make people more aware of the data that they are handing over to companies. We think that's completely fine. We also think that ignorance of the law is not a defense in the law, right? Just because you choose not to read the terms and conditions doesn't necessarily mean that that's a defense. Those things should be provided for you, and perhaps they should be provided in less legalese, but ultimately they are still there. And as long as we continue to have those things, it's not ignorance. The other thing is that they say that people should be aware of the data collected. We also want to show you that so many people get access to services when they get to hand over their data and not hand over cash in ways that they couldn't afford. Think of free Wi-Fi hotspots. Think of all those free services that get provided to people who are from the poorer end of society, who couldn't honestly have paid the amount that everyone pays every month towards their internet connection. Being able to hand over their private data, as long as they're aware of it and what it's potentially going to be used for, that's an okay thing to do. We're fine with that. The last thing is in this whole idea of the private people are being spied on, and this is the thing. Look, mass data collection, the way in which it works, yes, it can be tapping into internet cables, but it's millions of data points which are then looked at by an algorithm, not a dirty old man staring at your dick pics on Snapchat, right? It is the kind of people who are looking for millions of points in order to be able to track, especially with the national security where this is the most nefarious use of mass collection of data. It's not people looking at your each individual emails, it's looking for certain data points and looking for those certain signals that can lead to, you buying huge amounts of fertilizer on the internet that perhaps is a warning sign that we should be looking at. People aren't going to consent into it at that point, right? When they think potentially that they could be caught doing something dodgy, no one's going to consent into that. At that point, you probably have to breach consent in order to keep people safe. Moving on. So, look, the gentleman in the front here says it's about how our data is used and how this is honestly where we care. Look, most people and most politicians are terrified of a terrorist attack. They are terrified that it will happen within their career, that a loved one will not come home off the street, that that person will end up in a situation and a risk that they could not possibly have controlled. We hand over huge power to the state because we trust them to keep us safe in the way that we allow police to, for example, end up using extra power on us, allow us to restrict our freedom of movement. All those things we hand over to a state, allow the army to fight on our behalf, because we want to be safe, ultimately to be able to live our lives without that fear that our lives are going to be turned upside down. The moment that a politician is asked, why did my loved one not come home? Why did this person not turn up at my door, walk through that door and say hello to me? They're asked, why did that national security fail? Why are you in a position of failure? We live in a world where politicians are always going to be scared of national security failures. They're always going to be scared of that next terrorist attack. It's just how we deal with that and how we collect that information, how the government chooses to collect that information in order to stop things in future, because they will continue to collect this data. It's just the way in which they choose to collect that data is the issue. So No, thanks. So we think this issue is like, what is going to be the alternative? Because at the point where we start pressuring the government to stop collecting information, where we pressure government not to turn up and not to rifle through Facebook or rifle through private communications, on our side of the House, the much more likely thing that is likely to happen, given that politicians will continue to fear terrorist attacks, that will continue to fear threats to their national security, they're still going to collect this data, but they're going to collect it in much more harmful ways than using an algorithm which looks through millions of points of data and never reads any specifics beyond what the algorithm tells it to. We think this leads to things like more random stop and searches of minorities and much more wide granting of search warrants within perceived high-risk communities where they knock down doors and go search through your things. We think that's probably a bigger harm to people, right? Because the difference between people say, oh, it's like leaving your curtains open at night. Would you let people rifle through your bins? That is not the dichotomy in this world, right? We don't feel that same risk to our everyday lives when the government is looking at us. If anyone saw John Oliver and this whole segment on this, right? He told everyone that the NSA was spying on him when he did the Edward Snowden segment. He told everyone in the streets, and the only thing people cared about is that the government might be holding some nude pictures of them. That is literally what everyone cared about. Nobody cared that the government had information about what shopping they bought online. Nobody cared about the fact that they had their private information, who they had broken up with everything else. They didn't care because that information was already in the public domain to a certain extent. There are very few things that we as a generation and subsequent generations are keeping in private. So at that point that people care less on their imposition on their own lives, we think on the whole we'd much rather government be mass collecting this data. But the most harmful way in which governments have used to collect this data in ways which we would much rather there be a mass collection of data in order to be able to guarantee our national security is undercover police. They're one of the most effective but most harmful ways of collecting this data. They embed themselves into communities, in your place of worship, on your street, deep into these people's lives in order to collect the information on them in ways that they think are going to be useful in order to keep the world safe. They think they become so much part of that community, they become such a key figure, that sometimes they even become a loved one, a parent within that community, as is tragically seen in the early 2000s, where female environmental and political activists were tricked by undercover police officers and entered into relationships with them. That is the harm in which we get when the state wants to collect information in these ways and needs to, because there is that ultimate fear that they will be the ones responsible for a national security breach. When we say that we cannot and we should not let them have this power, we think at that end it's difficult for us to say that's a good alternative. And even if that isn't undercover police, that is the thing where you knock on people's doors as a police officer. That's a lot more intrusive into your lives and a lot more scary. That's a lot more of your time and the waste things. I can see the gentleman over here is disagreeing with me, but the problem is that's because he's probably a white man, right? At the point at which, I'm just going to point it out right now, if you are someone probably from a minority community, someone who is likely to be targeted, on balance, what is likely to be more appealing to you? The fact that something is less intrusive in your lives and something that is not, you aren't going to see on an everyday basis, the police walking through your community, the police knocking on your doors, the police searching through your things on a daily basis. We think at that point, we'd prefer a world in which they looked at things. We think when it becomes difficult for the oversight, because we think it is potentially easier to have oversight over things like data collection than it is under things like undercover police officers. We think you are less able to verify claims given the burden of proof on undercover police officers. It becomes a he said, she said situation in so many of these things. It becomes almost impossible to convict officers of wrongdoing. All these things are horrible in oversight and really, really difficult to prove and cause huge damage to people's lives. Yes, we think the current system isn't perfect, but there is more room for oversight. What do we want to see? We think we want to see on our side of the House as well more oversight, more accountability. The Intelligence and Security Committee, who are the current oversight of GCHQ, we think at that point they should be doing more investigating. There should be more in public inquiries. One second. We think on that end, if there is a political pressure for more oversight, but not necessarily against the actual data collection, that's when we get change. Yes?
Isn't the fact that you want more oversight a concession that you do fear large-scale data collection?
No, not at all. I want more oversight over my MP not spending stuff on duck houses. That doesn't mean I fear him or his spending habits. It just means that I potentially do want outcomes to be better, and I think it would be better in the public domain. That doesn't mean you fear something, right? I think fear is bigger when you end up collecting data in these ways that are much more harmful to people, when their data is being collected in the ways that they try and enforce them. If the small concession is that you want to say that it's fear, I think previous opposition speakers proven to you that people probably don't fear their public data being in the public domain, but we think ultimately, if it comes down to it on balance, we'd much rather that the data that you put online is the one that is collected, the one that the government rifles through, instead of your private personal belongings. At the end of the day, we think that is the dichotomy in this debate. And if Prop want to say, well, that's you squirreling it or saying that we want oversight, just because we say the system isn't perfect doesn't mean you should demolish it, right? It just means we want some reform. It doesn't mean we want to get rid of it in its entirety. The last thing that Proposition said is that, where is it? Oh yeah. We're unaware of how it's collected, and that's a reason to stop it. As I've said before, it just means we want change, right? We want changes that make it easier to understand the system, easier to understand what your data is being collected, but ultimately, we don't mind the fact it's taken without your consent if it's going to lead to a situation where people are safer. But even if it's not leading to safety, we think ultimately people are better off when the government taps into their data rather than kicks down their door. We think that's the difference in this debate and ultimately why you should oppose.
Thank you very much, Katie. Right, back to you in the audience. Does anyone have any points that they would like to make from the floor, starting with a point in proposition? Down at the front. Sorry, you can pick.
Richard Parkins, Trinity College. The opposition have suggested that we can withhold our consent to the collection of personal data. So if I'm going to withhold my consent, I should not ever have a mobile phone or make a call on one. I should not even make a call on a landline. I should not live in a house. I should never go and see a doctor. I should not have a driving license, own a car, have a passport, travel abroad. All of these things, in order to do, I have to give away personal data, and I do not have a realistic option of not consenting. It isn't real.
Points in opposite. Oh, do you want to respond to that?
Probably don't get full consent, but there is, if presumably there was enough of a market opening up, first of all, for the fact of not taking data collection in that sort of way, there would be mobile services opening up that would offer people those services, right? Presumably at a premium, because they aren't taking your data, aren't using it ways to market that and gain a profit. But second of all, there's lots of things you don't consent into, which ultimately the state makes you do in the first place. You live in this state and presumably don't get to move, and you consent into living in this state. You didn't get that choice in the first place, but we still allow you to be in that decision and make that decision in the first place. We don't think necessarily consent has to enter into every single part of your life in order to live a secure life and a happy life.
Do we have any points in opposition from the floor then? No points in opposition at all? You all agree with the motion? Do we have any points in abstention? Yeah, down at the front.
That guy in the front who's been cited a few times this debate. So in response to both occasions, so firstly, you referring to me kind of handing it to you saying, well, that's the point, you've got control. Richard actually rather nicely followed on from what I didn't fit into the 15-second POI for, there you go, another TLA, for sake of briefness. That a lot of these things, you've got the issue of peer pressure of, yes, you've got the choice of whether or not you use that communication service, but the reason we use communication platforms is because there's other people to communicate with on them. And whilst it's all well and good saying, well, I've come up with this beautiful new product which has got end-to-end encryption and is everything's hosted in a country that's got very, very good data protection laws, but no one else actually uses it. So arguing that I've got full consent there's a little bit disingenuous. Secondly, the shaking the head one, that was actually questioning whether or not we need to put surveillance of really that magnitude, be it through undercover police officers or
big data surveillance on environmental protesters, but I guess it's easier just to assume what I'm going to say.
As much as I applaud your efforts to withhold your name and personal data, you were on committee with William for 9 months. I'm pretty sure he knows your name. He's going to write it down anyway. Yeah, sorry, Professor Millard, I'll give you a chance to respond.
I didn't actually talk about consent, although it appears that you think that I did. Most lawful processing of personal data is not actually based on consent. There are other grounds that justify. I don't control the microphone. Can somebody turn it on?
It's on.
It's on, great. Yeah, sorry. I didn't actually talk about consent. Most lawful processing of personal data is not based on consent. It's based on other grounds, such as contractual necessity. So you want to buy something, well, you have to pay for it. You want it to be delivered, you have to give your address. You want to travel to Los Angeles and book a hotel, you've got to do various things. Whether or not it's about consent, it's called contractual necessity. There are other grounds, such as legitimate interests of business that don't unduly prejudice your rights, and so on. And the examples that the gentleman from Trinity College made, yes, I mean, there was a time in the early days of motoring when you could drive anonymously. You didn't have number plates, you didn't have to say who you were. I mean, for those days have long gone. There are good public reasons why we like to know whose car it is and who's driving. So this idea of total anonymity being the goal, I mean, what strikes me about this House and many of its motions is there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of regret, there's not a lot of constructive engagement. Fear is ultimately dysfunctional. It's about fight or flight, and, you know, you've got to decide what you want to do.
Okay, I think we'll take this point to move back to the main debate and move on to our final proposition speaker of the evening. Katherine Dunbar is one of Cambridge's top debaters, having made the final of this year's Oxford IB. Her other qualifications include the fact that she is a regular Facebook and Twitter user, and she bears a striking resemblance to one of tonight's emergency debate speakers. Katherine, the floor is yours.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd asked me about 2 hours ago, before I found out I was in this debate, if I cared about the large-scale collection of personal data, I would have frankly told you that I did not give two shits. Having done a little bit of research, I can tell you that I now do care, and I can tell you why it's important that I care, and why it's important that we regard the large-scale collection of personal data with skepticism, and with a healthy dose of fear that actually brings about productive conversations, right? Because opposition are happy to concede that some things have to change, some stricter measures need to be put in place. No one points those things out unless they start caring. No one starts caring unless they get a little bit freaked out about where their personal data is going. Like, I beg to differ that fear is ultimately dysfunctional and that it's not fight or flight. When you consider the parties that are interested in large-scale data, what you have is a conflict of interest between huge companies that stand to benefit from having your data and the government that stands to benefit from having your data in industries that are largely unregulated and non-transparent, that can use it however they want and find legal loopholes and create legal loopholes for themselves, versus people who are providing this data who, much like myself until 2 hours ago, don't give a shit. If the other party doesn't care, then this data can be misused, right? Like, there is a huge scale for people to misuse this data, use it in ways that you don't know about it, use it in ways that make you uncomfortable. What I'm standing for on this side of the House is that a healthy dose of fear is something that leads to sensible discussion when the other party that you're talking to has a massive interest in exploiting you, right? So it's important to be skeptical, it's important to know what you're dealing with, it's important to be a little bit afraid so that you actually look into the kind of contracts that you're getting involved with, right? So I think, like, I would rather fear to apathy in this kind of discussion. I would rather generate a discussion because someone says, hey, isn't it freaky that Target can predict I'm pregnant? I'll tell you more about that later. That's an important discussion to be having. So let's talk about this debate in sort of two key areas that we've touched on already. So first of all is this issue of consent and what I've just learned about contractual necessity and weighing those two things up. And then secondly, we'll talk about privacy and why, as a base principle, it's something that people do have some kind of right to, or why, at the very least, you would feel afraid if that privacy is violated. So firstly, on this issue of consent, right? So we've heard from the second speaker on our side of the House a bit about how, like, consent is an underlying principle in terms of people's autonomy, in terms of democracy, and their ability to choice. What we get told about our choice when getting involved with big data by the other side of the house, which is fine specifically what we're told, is that we can do this really novel thing, which is turning off our phone. First of all, I absolutely cannot do that, and I refuse to turn off my phone at any time. I sleep with it next to me, I have it on, I'm constantly checking my email, right? And I'm not alone in that, because it is impossible in the modern world to turn off the grid, right? It is just absolutely impossible. Something like, what is it? Here's my fun statistics page. 3/4 of internet users have Facebook accounts, right? Facebook sucks data from you all the time. And don't get me wrong, I love targeted ads. How many dresses have I bought off of ASOS that I didn't need because they caught me at a moment of weakness and showed me a dress they knew I liked, right? That is fantastic and does benefit my life in a lot of ways. What doesn't benefit my life in a lot of ways, and what is quite worrying about this, is that often the parties that are showing you these targeted ads are selling your data on to other parties. So even when you get yourself taken off of the internet and you go through the legal proceedings to do that, there are chances that data brokers have already bought all of that information, and the company that you asked to get, to remove your data from, will buy that information back after you've asked to be removed. That's pretty freaky. I'm a little scared. That is an issue of consent, right? Because it means that even where you think you can consent to something, even when you think you have a reasonable choice, you don't. And these kind of companies do all they can to get away with making it look like you do have that choice, because it massively benefits them to be able to take advantage of you in that way, right? So then on to this idea that Katie raises of we can educate people more about how to use the internet, and we can teach people to read terms and conditions. On the second point, that is literally never going to happen. No one is going to sit through and read the iTunes terms and conditions. That just isn't going to happen. But secondly, on educating people about what kind of information they put on the internet, largely relies on a rhetoric of fear. That is the main way you tell people not to put stupid shit on the internet, is you tell them to be afraid of how it can be misused. That is where fear is helpful. It is to scare children into doing stupid shit, into not doing stupid shit. Sorry, there we go. And teach people to be a little bit afraid about how their information can be misused. It is a healthy dose of fear there. It is useful and generates a productive discussion. Then lastly, on this idea that it's fine to violate consent to prevent terrorist attacks. So first of all, really sneaky of Katie here to tell you that she was taking the high burden, because she wasn't. She was telling you, here's the extreme of terrorist attacks versus people collecting your data. That's not the real comparative in this debate. Notoriously, studies have been published to prove that mass data collection is pretty terrible at predicting terrorist attacks. It's not very good at it. They often cock up and attack people who've done nothing wrong, or they just kind of miss things. We haven't got the algorithm right yet. But secondly, that's not the comparative. The comparative is your data being used in loads of different ways that you don't consent to, and massive companies using you as a product and profiting off of you in a way that you don't know and can't reasonably be involved with. It's a smaller comparative, sure, and it's not as glamorous as saving the world, but it's still something that's important to a lot of people, right? Where's your data going? Who's profiting off of you? Why can't you get your information taken off of the internet? Because even though you delete that embarrassing Facebook status from 2010, Facebook still have it, right? They still claim your intellectual property, and it's not really a reasonable choice to log off of Facebook, but they still have every stupid thing I said when I was 11 on there, and some really embarrassing photos of a terrible haircut. That even if I take them down, they still retain the right to use that, and that's kind of problematic. So secondly, onto this idea of privacy and why that's important. So Katie rightly points out that what companies are using is actually millions of data points, and they're looking for trends rather than specifically trying to look for your nudes. So on that, scary story about Target, which is actually super cool. They have an algorithm, basically, that tells them, they found out that, if you can get people at times in their life when things change, they're likely to start shopping there more. So what lots of companies do is they check birth records, and when someone is born, they target that person, try and get them to start buying their nappies there and baby clothes there. And Target sell everything, so they want to get people involved. So they created an algorithm to try and predict from shopping patterns when women were pregnant, so they could get there before other companies target their advertising and get them as customers. Freaky thing, sometimes they could predict when women were pregnant before those women knew themselves. That's a little bit scary. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. It's not anywhere near the scale of a terrorist attack. But it's something to be aware of, something to be skeptical of, something to think about. Particularly, it's important to think about the fact that, like, which kind of companies can afford to process data on this massive a scale. And the problem with that is that you end up driving out competition, because if huge companies have all of the data and can use it in lots of ways, it means that smaller companies won't be able to access that same kind of information and are a comparative disadvantage. Like, this is the kind of dystopian world where your only choice is Target, your only choice is Amazon. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is, like, it's a bit of a problem, particularly given that, like, if we don't like oversee these companies in the way they're using things, and there is no organic market competition either, because let's face it, like, the only comparative competition to Facebook is MySpace, and I don't think I've seen anyone use MySpace in my lifetime. Like, if there's no competition, then there's no inherent regulation metric, but there's also no government regulation metric, because if people aren't scared, they're not having this conversation. They're just happy to wander around with these cookies on their phone. So the issue there is that, like, we get people misusing our data, taking advantage of us, and no one says, hey, wait a second, this is kind of weird, or what are we doing with this, or can we have a look at the metrics and the like formulas that are being used to assess us, okay? And then lastly, on this idea that, like, nobody cares about the information that's already in the public domain, and, like, we'd much rather have the government take this data than not, that Katie raises. So first of all, I don't buy that the comparison is like government taking your data, or like police literally sitting in your house asking you, you know, how was dinner? Like, that's not a fair comparison. There are ways that we can collect mass data and use it that don't involve, like, having police involved, like having undercover police, right? Or don't involve your data going off into God knows where with absolutely zero transparency, right? Like, there's a middle ground that we can reach where we can use data, we can collect data, but there's more transparency there, that people feel like they can engage better. And that starts with a dialogue of people getting worried, or people starting to talk about that. Like, all of the fantastic legal changes that we heard about from the first op speech, that didn't come from someone saying, who gives a shit? It comes from someone saying, hey, it would be really bad if something went wrong. We need to make sure that there are penalties in place. That's fear in action, ladies and gentlemen. That's saying that's preventative, right? That's the law trying to prevent something from going wrong. That's where fear is good. So, ladies and gentlemen, like, I'm not asking you to throw away your phone. I'm not asking you to scream when you see a targeted ad and say, oh my God, where the shit did this come from? Like, what I'm asking you to do is just be a little bit skeptical about every, like, terms and conditions that you say yes to. Be a little bit skeptical about all of the websites that say they use cookies. Like, just think about where your information is going. Have a think about what the internet is capable of. And where, like, there are massive problems, say something about it. Like, speak up, like, try and get the government involved, try and get regulation involved. It's a healthy dose of fear that produces a productive conversation. I think that's also probably why this House is afraid of so many things, is because it's a good way to start talking about them. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to support the motion.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And I'll now hand over to our final debate speaker of the evening. Edward Lucas is a senior editor at The Economist and senior vice president at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. He's also a strong critic of Edward Snowden. Edward, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, Mr. President, I'd like to begin by congratulating my opponent, Kate, not only for standing in for my friend John Schindler, the extraordinarily distinguished former official for the National Security Agency, who was meant to be here tonight, but also for giving a speech with which I'd have agreed with 100% if it had been given in about 1990. I think that you brilliantly outlined the dangers that exist from the collection of mass data, but you have, if I may say so, possibly ignored some of the things that have happened since 1990. And I think even today, Mr. President, if we had a motion which said this House regards the careless storage of immutable personal data collected from unwitting victims, I would be entirely on your side. I think it's atrocious that I'm asked to use my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, and other top-secret data readily available for my Wikipedia entry to identify myself when I go on the internet. It's one of the catastrophic mistakes that some companies make, is demanding immutable personal data and then expecting us to use that to identify ourselves. I agree that's very bad. I'd even settle for the word, instead of fear, resent or something like that. But I do feel that there has been, that we have got to accept that as technology moves on, we are always faced with new problems. When the automobile came in, we could have been sitting here maybe 120 years ago saying this house fears the automobile, these infernal machines, their horrible noises, no safety devices of any kind, no bumpers, no seat belts, not anything like that. In fact, this house would not have even known what those things were if we'd tried to describe them. No registration plates, no qualifications for the drivers, roaring through built-up areas, sending chickens and children and people flying and impaling them, and with no even offence of being drunk in charge of an automobile. When the telephone came in, people thought the telephone was the most infernal machine. In the old days, you could look up the Prime Minister's home number and dial him up at home. Can't do that now. When credit cards came in, I can imagine this house 40 or 50 years ago being absolutely appalled by the idea that people were going to get into appalling, irreversible debt in the hands of these fiendish pieces of plastic that would go into the pockets of the feckless and irresponsible. And guess what? At every stage, as new technological challenges have arrived, we have dealt with them. And there's nothing actually new about the collection of mass data. I suspect if you went back, I don't know what was happening actually here in about 1080, whenever it was AD, as if anyone here is reading history, they'll be able to correct me. But we have a thing called the Doomsday Book in this country, which was the first exercise in the collection of mass data. And I'm sure people even then said, I don't see why I should have to write down my humble manor house or my little castle and put it in some great book where the king's going to look at it and probably going to tax it. And what happened after that? Well, we evolved, we developed laws, we had parliament, we developed the whole system of constraining the kind of arbitrary privilege that King William the Conqueror and his predecessors involved, to the point that we have now the entirely benign and easy to deal with Inland Revenue, or HMRC as it's called. But that is progress compared with what we used to have. And I do detect the soft, slushy footfall of straw men wandering around this august table. I was told by, I think, someone on the other side that the government is able to tell how we vote. I am unaware that our voting is in a central database, and I can't quite understand how that would work. Of course, sir, please, go ahead.
The government is not able to tell how people vote unless it wants to. All votes are traceable by the voter registration number on the back of the ballot. So the government can tell if it wishes.
That's absolutely true, but as I'm sure you and everybody else in the House would know, that what we can do is not the same as what we do. And I could, if I wanted to, produce a box of matches, set fire to your book. As I understand, the famous pictures in this building were set fire to not just over 21 years ago. There's all sorts of terrible things governments can do, and governments are constrained in doing those by public opinion, by law, by the elected representatives who we put in Parliament, by fear of being found out, and all sorts of other things. But the fact is we do not have this kind of invisible data, this idea of this data anarchy, which you so brilliantly outlined in your opening speech, because we have all sorts of rules and laws and conventions which govern it. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. 15 years ago, when I first came back from Moscow working for The Economist, I wrote a story about red diesel, which is a kind of agricultural diesel that farmers buy, and sometimes very naughty people buy it and use it for driving cars on the road. And I was always amazed for years afterwards, whenever I logged onto the internet and browsed anything, little adverts for red diesel would come up, because obviously there was some cookie on my computer that showed that I'd Googled and done a lot of things about red diesel, and therefore I might be interested in buying it. And I, in the end, got irritated with this and installed a thing called AdBlock, and I heartily commend it to you. And if you find that the targeted adverts on Facebook are becoming just a bit too irresistible, well, then install AdBlock. And guess what? Life's evolved. If you now go onto the website of Der Spiegel, and I recommend all of you, if you speak German or even English now, because they have an English edition, you want to know what the Germans are thinking, go to Der Spiegel, and a little sign comes up, and actually on The Guardian as well, saying, hello, we see you're using AdBlocker. Please don't use AdBlocker, because that's how we make our money, or if you are going to use AdBlocker, give us some money. So there's constant evolution between the commercial pressure on one side, the citizens' pressure on the other side. It's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be a tension. But there's also always competition. We do have the choice of complaining. We can go to our elected representatives. We can write to the newspapers. We can have debates. Ultimately, we can even boycott companies. And you mentioned MySpace. And indeed, MySpace is a good example of a company that disappointed its customers in all sorts of different ways, and they migrated from MySpace to Facebook. And I believe there's a thing called LinkedIn, which you move on to after Facebook. And I profoundly hope, as someone who's a victim of these pestilential emails from LinkedIn, that they too go out of business as well. But to be serious, we do have a whole array. We have the extremely tough European Data Directive, and I'm sure you all read all this stuff really importantly. If you're the kind of bonkers UKIP people who think we'd be better outside the EU, then of course you can make a bonfire of all this stuff. But if you actually care about how your data is being looked at, the EU Data Directive is really, really tough. There's also, if you're an American citizen, you'll be glad to know that America uniquely, unlike any other country, gives not just Americans privacy rights when it comes to the collection of bulk data, but also foreigners. That's not something you get with GCHQ, it's not something you get with the KSI, it's not something you get with the French, but under PPD 28, President Obama in January last year said these are the only 6 grounds on which you can collect bulk data that involves people's personal information, and they were things like terrorism, child abuse, and so on, things that I don't think anybody would disagree with. He specifically, incidentally, outlawed the collection of personal data from foreigners or Americans on grounds of political dissent or criticism, or for anything that would give the United States companies a commercial advantage. So this stuff's out there. Now, you may say it's too boring, it's too geeky, it's too tough, it's too soft, but the idea that we live in some kind of data anarchy, where everything you do online is immediately pillaged by everybody from Google to GCHQ, is a wonderful debating point, and it might have been true in 1990, but it bears no relation to reality now. Now, that we've heard a lot about fear, and there is every reason to be afraid of totalitarian governments. I used to live in Moscow. I'm worried about Vladimir Putin. I would hate to live in North Korea. I would hate to live in all sorts of totalitarian governments. And it's true that if you have a totalitarian government, with the tools they have now, they will use big data as part of the repressive means against their population. But previous eras of totalitarian government, going right back to the Dark Ages and even to classical civilization, were perfectly good at being repressive, even without big data. Of course, it gives them capabilities. But if you're worried about Big Brother, then you're not worried about Big Brother's use of big data. You're worried about Big Brother. And I'm sure many people here have seen The Bourne Identity and the other parts of that trilogy. It's a fantastic film. It's really enjoyable. I do recommend it. But please bear in mind, it's not a documentary. It's written by people like me, people who write for a living. It's great fun. That's not the way the real world works. We are not living in North Korea. You are not living under the constant scrutiny of Big Brother. We've heard a lot about privacy and anonymity and so on, and I would argue very strongly, and my brief plug for my book here, if you haven't read it, Cyberphobia, is all about this. I think privacy and anonymity are different. I'm basically against anonymity, and I'm strongly in favor of privacy. When we go out in the world, we do not, as a rule, wear masks. You may wear masks if you go to a Venetian-style masked ball, if you go to some kind of sordid swingers club. There are places where we want to be anonymous for a very good reason, and that's fine. I think people have the right to be anonymous, but it shouldn't be the default setting. The whole basis of civilization is the trustful interaction between people who don't know each other very well, and for that, I think you need to be able to establish who you're dealing with. If you want to stay private, that's fine, but when you're dealing with other people, you do have to give away some of the details, otherwise I think civilization becomes impossible. So I'll conclude by saying, if you want to say, should we be cautious? Yes, of course we should be cautious. Should we be prudent? We should be prudent. Should we be vigilant? Yes. Should we be even apprehensive? Yes, I'll settle for apprehensive. I'll even settle for, as in Kate's words, a little bit skeptical. I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. But fear, let's say fear for the things we really need to be scared of, and there's plenty of them out there, goodness knows. Please reject this motion and concentrate on something more important.